A few minutes before work, someone walks into a cafe, places an order, and leaves carrying a hot cup of coffee, as if nothing about it could possibly be unusual. But this ordinary drink was once guarded by governments like a strategic secret. People were arrested for drinking it, empires sent agents to steal living plants, and millions were forced to labor on the land that produced it. The customer wanted alertness. Merchants saw profit. Rulers looked at crowded coffee houses and saw conversations they could not control. Colonial powers looked at a small evergreen tree and saw an asset capable of financing trade, expanding territory, and enriching entire commercial systems. Coffee did not conquer the world through flavor alone. It became powerful because it helped people stay awake longer, concentrate more intensely, gather in new social spaces, and work according to a faster, more disciplined rhythm. This story begins with a wild plant growing beneath the forest canopy of Ethiopia, but it ends inside a global industry where the people who cultivate the crop can still hold less power than those who roast, brand, and sell it. Yet before coffee became a commodity, a corporation, or a symbol of modern life, humans did not even know what to do with its small red fruit. The most famous origin story begins with an Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi, who supposedly noticed his animals becoming unusually energetic after eating bright red berries from a wild shrub. They jumped, bleated, and refused to settle down. So Kaldi tried the fruit himself and felt a sudden burst of alertness. It is a memorable story, but it should not be treated as confirmed history. The earliest written versions appeared centuries after the events they describe, and many of the familiar details were probably added through repeated retelling. The more important question is not whether Kaldi existed, but why this legend was placed in Ethiopia in the first place. The answer lies in the plant itself. Coffea arabica grows naturally in the highland forests of southwestern Ethiopia, where cool temperatures, elevation, regular rainfall, and shade beneath the forest canopy create ideal conditions for the species. Long before roasted coffee became a common drink, local communities were already using the plant in different ways. Leaves could be steeped, berries could be chewed, and the fruit or seeds could be combined with other ingredients as a portable source of energy. Ethiopia was therefore the biological homeland of coffee, and one of the earliest places where people recognized its effects. But it was not yet the center of an organized coffee economy. That transformation occurred across the Red Sea in Yemen. By the 15th century, Sufi communities there were using a coffee-based drink to remain awake during long nights of prayer, chanting, and religious devotion. This marked a decisive change in coffee's function. It was no longer simply a useful wild plant gathered when available. It became a regularly consumed tool for managing wakefulness. Repeated demand required a more dependable supply, so farmers in Yemen began cultivating coffee systematically on mountain slopes and terraced fields. In a dry and difficult landscape, they organized water, land, harvesting, drying, processing, and consumption into a connected chain. Coffee had become a crop with a purpose, a market, and a production system. The port of Mocha then turned that system into international trade. Coffee grown in Yemen's interior moved through the port toward Egypt, the Ottoman world, and eventually Europe. The word mocha, now associated with a coffee flavor, still carries the memory of the harbor that once stood at the center of global supply. Yemeni merchants also understood that the most valuable part of the trade was not only the bean people could roast and drink, but the living seed that could create a competing industry somewhere else. Before export, beans were often boiled or partially heated to reduce their ability to germinate. This was not merely a method of preservation. It was an economic defense. Sell the finished product, but never sell the means of independent production. Ethiopia provided the biological origin, religious communities created sustained demand, and Yemen connected cultivation, processing, and monopoly into the first true coffee industry. Yet Yemen could control the seed only for so long. Once millions of people had experienced the drink, they could no longer control what those people wanted to do with it. And when coffee entered the great cities of the Ottoman Empire, the most dangerous thing was no longer inside the cup. It was the conversation forming around it. As coffee moved through the Ottoman world, it entered cities such as Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Istanbul. But it did not remain a private drink consumed only for religious discipline. It created a new kind of urban gathering place. Ottoman coffeehouses were crowded, noisy, and socially active. Men met friends, played chess and backgammon, listened to storytellers, heard poetry, exchanged commercial news, discussed military campaigns, and repeated rumors about officials, taxes, and the imperial court. What made these places unusual was not simply the beverage being served, but the freedom to remain there. Most public life had previously been organized around spaces with clearly defined purposes. The household belonged to the family, the market to buying and selling, the workshop to labor, and the mosque to religious authority. A coffeehouse offered something different. For the price of a cup, people could sit for an extended period, encounter strangers, and take part in conversations that were not directed by an employer, a religious leader, or a government official. Caffeine kept customers awake, but the larger transformation came from the network that formed around them. A report carried in from a port could pass from table to table before reaching another neighborhood. A complaint about rising prices could meet similar complaints from people who had never spoken before. A private frustration could become a shared interpretation of public events. Information that had once moved slowly through official channels now traveled through stories, arguments, jokes, and rumor. That was the real source of anxiety for those in power. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Khair Beg, attempted to suppress coffee, presenting it as an intoxicating substance that violated religious law. Coffeehouses were closed and drinkers were questioned, although the ban was soon overturned by higher authority. Later, Ottoman rulers also tried to regulate or eliminate coffeehouse culture, and the reign of Sultan Murad IV became associated with especially severe punishments for forbidden drinking. Some of the most dramatic stories may have been exaggerated in later retellings, but the repeated attempts at suppression reveal something important. Authorities were not investing this much effort because a bitter drink was physically dangerous. They were responding to the social behavior surrounding it. Closing a coffeehouse meant breaking up a meeting place, limiting how people used their free time, interrupting the movement of news, and preventing unapproved discussion from developing into collective opinion. Coffee became politically significant because it allowed people to think aloud in the presence of others. It did not create rebellion by itself, but it made connection easier, and connection could turn isolated individuals into a public. This pattern would soon appear again in Europe, where coffeehouses emerged during a period of expanding trade, scientific debate, publishing, and finance. If Ottoman rulers had feared what ordinary customers might say over coffee, what would happen when the same kind of gathering place brought together merchants, investors, sailors, writers, and political thinkers at the center of Europe's changing economy? Europeans initially regarded coffee as a suspicious foreign drink from the Muslim world, but curiosity quickly overcame resistance. Once they developed a taste for it, they no longer wanted merely to purchase the finished beans. They wanted control of the living tree itself. When coffee first reached Europe, many people did not see it as an innocent new drink. Its dark color, bitter taste, and association with the Muslim world made it suspicious to some religious authorities, who warned that it might carry foreign habits into Christian society. Yet the controversy worked like free advertising. The more people argued about whether coffee should be banned, the more others wanted to know what made it so dangerous. Once merchants, officials, and consumers accepted it, coffeehouses spread rapidly through Venice, London, Paris, and other commercial cities. Their importance came not from the famous writers or scientists who occasionally sat inside them, but from the way these rooms reorganized access to information. For the relatively low price of a cup, a person could remain for hours, listen to reports from abroad, read newspapers and commercial notices, and meet people outside his normal occupation. Sailors brought news of storms, wars, damaged ships, and delayed cargoes. Merchants compared prices from distant ports. Investors searched for ventures that needed capital. Writers and natural philosophers exchanged manuscripts, experiments, and political arguments. A coffeehouse gathered people who possessed information, people who possessed money, and people who possessed opportunities, then placed them close enough for conversation to become business. That is why some of these establishments developed functions that later belonged to formal institutions. At Edward Lloyd's Coffeehouse in London, shipowners, captains, merchants, and underwriters exchanged detailed reports about vessels and cargoes. The value of that information was practical. If a voyage faced a known risk, several investors could divide the possible loss in return for payment. Over time, those repeated agreements helped form the market that became Lloyd's of London. Around Jonathan's coffee house, brokers and traders met to buy and sell shares and commodities before a modern stock exchange existed in its later institutional form. The coffee house did not create finance from nothing. It reduced the distance between news and decision, allowing a report about a ship, a harvest, or a war to become a price, a contract, or an investment within the same social space. Scientific and political ideas moved through the same mechanism. A claim could be challenged at one table, repeated at another, printed the next day, and carried into a wider public debate. Europe's appetite for coffee therefore grew alongside a new urban economy built on faster information. But that success exposed a serious weakness. Europeans could buy more beans, yet they still depended heavily on supply moving through Yemen and the wider Red Sea trade. They could not freely determine how much coffee would be grown, when it would arrive, or what price they would ultimately pay. A disrupted route, a political conflict, or a poor harvest could affect the entire market. The central question was no longer where to purchase coffee. It was who would control viable plants, who would own the next growing region, and who could remove Yemeni merchants from the chain. The Dutch moved aggressively. In the early 17th century, a Dutch trader reportedly obtained a living coffee plant or fertile material from Mocha and carried it back to the Netherlands. Once secured, the plant entered a botanical garden. But these gardens were not merely decorative collections of exotic species. They functioned as laboratories of empire. Specialists tested whether foreign plants could survive in new conditions, learned how to reproduce them from seeds or cuttings, and then transferred promising crops to overseas territories where land and administration were already under colonial control. Coffee was introduced into places such as Java, where Dutch authorities combined the plant with existing ports, shipping networks, taxation, and local labor systems. Production expanded so successfully that Java eventually became another word for coffee in everyday speech. That linguistic change reveals how completely a colonial growing region could replace the original homeland in the imagination of consumers. France pursued the same strategic goal. In the 1720s, the naval officer Gabriel de Clieu transported a young coffee plant from Europe toward Martinique in the Caribbean. The plant was protected inside a glass case, but the voyage nearly destroyed it. The ship encountered violent weather, fresh water became scarce, and the fragile tree began to fail. De Clieu was later said to have shared part of his own ration to keep it alive until the ship reached the island. It is an excellent survival story, but the plant did not matter simply because one determined man saved it. Its real historical importance came after arrival. Martinique was not an empty island waiting for a heroic gardener. It was part of a colonial system with controlled land, organized transport, commercial credit, and political authority capable of multiplying one plant into thousands, then sending descendants across the Caribbean and beyond. The seedling provided biological potential. Empire supplied the machinery of expansion. This is where the adventure story usually ends too soon. Stealing a viable plant could break Yemen's monopoly, but it could not by itself create a coffee empire. To turn a rare tree into a global commodity, colonial powers still needed vast territory, long-term capital, warehouses, ports, and a labor force that did not have the freedom to refuse. A coffee seedling could survive in a new colony and still produce nothing of commercial importance. Large-scale coffee required far more than suitable weather. It needed fertile land, dependable water, years of investment before the first meaningful harvest, roads to move cherries and beans, warehouses to protect them, ports to export them, credit to finance the next season, and a labor force large enough to repeat the same work across thousands of acres. European empires already possessed this machinery through their colonial systems. Governments reassigned land, commercial companies organized shipping, lenders advanced money against future crops, and plantation owners used political power to keep labor costs brutally low. Across Java, the Caribbean, and South America, local conditions differed, but the structure remained strikingly similar. Authorities or large landowners controlled the soil. Workers had little power to determine where, how long, or under what terms they labored. The beans were shipped outward, while the greatest profits accumulated in commercial centers far from the fields where the crop was grown. In Java, Dutch colonial rule pushed local communities into producing export crops within a system designed around imperial revenue rather than rural choice. Farmers supplied land and labor under coercive arrangements, while coffee moved through Dutch-controlled channels toward European markets. In Suriname and the French Caribbean, enslaved Africans and other forced laborers cleared fields, planted trees, harvested cherries, and processed the crop under plantation discipline. The methods of coercion varied by place, but the economic direction was the same. Production risk remained in the colony, while pricing power traveled with merchants, financiers, and shipowners. Brazil would expand this model to an extraordinary scale. The country had vast territory, favorable growing regions, and Atlantic ports, and once viable coffee plants were established, cultivation moved through Rio de Janeiro, the Paraíba Valley, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. But climate alone did not make Brazil the dominant producer. Forests had to be cleared, roads and storage facilities built, and enormous quantities of labor mobilized over decades. Much of that labor came from enslaved Africans and their descendants. Workers cut through dense vegetation, dug planting holes, carried seedlings, weeded fields, picked ripe cherries by hand, spread them across drying yards, turned them under the sun, removed the outer layers, and sorted the beans for export. The process was repetitive, physically punishing, and exposed people to heat, disease, injury, inadequate food, poor shelter, and violence. Plantation owners controlled not only the crop, but the movement and survival of the people producing it. In many cases, the system treated human beings as replaceable inputs. Improving food, housing, or medical care cost money. Purchasing or coercing additional labor could appear cheaper to those calculating profit. Brazil's slavery survived until 1888 for many political and social reasons, but coffee wealth became one of the strongest economic interests supporting its continuation during the 19th century. Every stage of the trade then separated danger from reward. The worker closest to the tree faced weather, illness, injury, punishment, and the possibility of a failed harvest. The plantation owner held legal control over the land and crop. Export merchants decided when and where to sell. Shipping firms controlled movement across the ocean. Financial centers extended credit, insured cargoes, and helped determine prices before many consumers had ever seen a bean. At the far end, a buyer in Europe or North America encountered a clean, roasted product with a pleasant aroma, while the violence and uncertainty of production remained almost completely invisible. This created a contradiction that still matters. Proximity to the coffee plant did not produce power within the coffee economy. The people whose hands gave the commodity its physical form often had the least control over its value. In the Caribbean, coffee and sugar plantations formed part of a broader system of slavery, racial hierarchy, and colonial extraction that generated deep social instability. Brutal conditions contributed to resistance, flight, sabotage, and rebellion. In Saint-Domingue, plantation violence was one element in the wider crisis that led to the Haitian Revolution. But coffee alone did not cause that uprising. Political exclusion, slavery, race, class conflict, international war, and revolutionary ideas all interacted. The more accurate conclusion is larger and more important. Coffee did not merely exist beside colonialism. It operated inside the same structure that seized land, disciplined labor, exported raw value, and concentrated wealth elsewhere. That imperial system turned coffee into a truly global commodity. Yet in North America, resistance against another empire would give the drink a very different meaning, transforming a colonial product into a symbol of an emerging nation. When American colonists dumped British East India Company tea into Boston Harbor in December 1773, they were rejecting more than a beverage. Tea had become tied to taxation, imperial authority, and the claim that Parliament could extract revenue from colonies without granting them political representation. Coffee was already known in North America, so the Boston Tea Party did not introduce it overnight. But the protest accelerated a cultural shift and gave coffee a new symbolic meaning. For some colonists, choosing coffee became a way to distance themselves from British power, while coffee houses in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York offered merchants, printers, shipowners, and political organizers places to exchange news and coordinate activity. A drink once associated with foreign trade was gradually absorbed into the identity of a new republic. Yet political symbolism alone could not make coffee an everyday necessity across a continent. That required technology. During the 19th century, steam-powered ships made ocean transport faster and more predictable, reducing the time between tropical ports and American markets. Industrial roasting equipment allowed companies to process far larger quantities with greater consistency, while improved sealed packaging protected roasted and ground coffee from air and moisture long enough to reach stores far from major ports. Together, these changes pushed coffee beyond elite homes and urban coffeehouses. It entered factories, farms, military camps, railroad towns, and ordinary kitchens. That expansion matched the demands of an industrial society in which more people were expected to arrive at fixed hours, remain attentive for long shifts, and organize daily life around schedules rather than daylight alone. Coffee was inexpensive enough to become routine, simple enough to prepare in many settings, and stimulating enough to support a faster rhythm of work. The same qualities made it especially useful in war. Beans could be transported in bulk, stored with other provisions, and brewed anywhere soldiers could heat water. A hot cup offered warmth during cold watches, helped men remain alert through exhaustion, and restored a small sense of normal life inside an environment defined by uncertainty. Preparing and sharing coffee also divided the day into recognizable moments: before a march, after guard duty, beside a campfire, or during a rare pause between movements. During the American Civil War, Union forces generally benefited from stronger access to imported coffee through northern ports and supply networks. Soldiers often received green beans, roasted them over fires, ground them by hand, and treated the resulting drink as one of the most valued parts of their ration. The Confederacy, restricted by the Union naval blockade, faced severe shortages and turned to substitutes made from roasted chicory, sweet potatoes, acorns, grains, and other available ingredients. None fully reproduced the familiar taste or effect. Coffee did not determine the outcome of the war, and it would be misleading to present it as a secret weapon. What it revealed was something broader. Armies are sustained not only by rifles and ammunition, but by transportation, food, clothing, rest, morale, and the ability to keep thousands of people functioning on schedule. Reliable coffee was one small but visible sign of a supply system capable of reaching soldiers consistently. The world wars expanded that relationship between coffee, industry, and logistics. Modern armies had to provision millions of troops across Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, often under conditions where grinding beans and brewing carefully were impossible. Instant coffee fit the military requirement because it was compact, fast to prepare, easy to distribute, and relatively uniform. Governments purchased enormous quantities, encouraging manufacturers to enlarge factories, improve processing, and develop packaging suited to long-distance shipment. Soldiers drank coffee during night watches, inside trenches, aboard ships, at airfields, and in temporary camps, until the habit became part of military routine. When they returned home, many carried that routine with them. Products associated with field rations moved into suburban kitchens, diners, offices, and workplaces, while companies that had expanded through wartime contracts found a massive civilian market waiting. By the middle of the 20th century, coffee had achieved something the merchants of Yemen could never have imagined. It had become familiar across social classes and deeply embedded in American daily life. But that success created the next crisis. As companies competed to make coffee cheaper, faster, longer lasting, and identical from one package to the next, they began removing the very flavor and individuality that had made the drink desirable in the first place. By the middle of the 20th century, coffee was everywhere in American life, but ubiquity came with a cost. Large companies were no longer competing mainly to produce the most distinctive flavor. They were optimizing raw material prices, roasting speed, shelf life, nationwide distribution, and the ability to make every package taste almost exactly the same. Lower-grade beans could be blended into the supply, darker roasting could conceal defects and regional differences, and coffee could remain on store shelves long enough to travel across the country. The system was efficient, but the cup increasingly became weak, bitter, stale, or simply forgettable. Coffee remained a daily habit, yet for many younger consumers, it began to feel like an outdated brown liquid. Their parents drank automatically rather than something worth enjoying. That decline created an opening for small roasters, specialty retailers, and coffee enthusiasts who moved in the opposite direction. Instead of hiding differences between beans, they emphasized them. They searched for higher quality Arabica, roasted in smaller batches, sold fresher coffee, identified countries and growing regions, taught customers how grind size and water temperature affected extraction, and treated preparation as a skill rather than an afterthought. Starbucks emerged from this broader environment, not as the single company that rescued American coffee, but as one participant in a growing reaction against anonymous mass-market blends. When Starbucks opened in Seattle in 1971, it primarily sold roasted whole beans, tea, and brewing equipment, rather than the menu of prepared drinks associated with the company today. The larger transformation came after Howard Schultz joined the business and traveled to Italy. In Milan, he saw something the American market had largely failed to develop: espresso bars, where coffee operated as a daily ritual and a social system. Customers stopped briefly on the way to work, exchanged greetings with the barista, recognized familiar faces, and returned to the same counter as part of the rhythm of neighborhood life. Schultz realized that people could be persuaded to buy more than caffeine, or even better beans. They could buy a place to pause, a setting where being alone did not feel isolating, a location for meetings, a sense of belonging, and an image of themselves as people with particular tastes. The ability to choose size, milk, flavor, and the number of espresso shots made the customer feel involved in constructing the product. Starbucks therefore changed where value was created. The bean still mattered, but so did the location, store design, music, service language, recognizable logo, consistency between cities, and direct relationship with the customer. Two cups made from similar raw material could sell at very different prices depending on the environment and story surrounding them. Economic power was shifting away from those who merely controlled growing land and toward those who controlled the final experience. Yet once global chains made specialty-style coffee standardized and widely available, another movement pushed back. Third-wave roasters argued that coffee should be treated less like a uniform industrial product and more like wine. They identified not only the producing country, but the specific region, farm, variety, elevation, harvest, and processing method. Roasting and brewing were adjusted to reveal floral, fruity, acidic, or textured qualities that mass production had once erased. Difference itself became valuable again, but as consumers began paying much more for origin, flavor, craftsmanship, and atmosphere, a difficult question emerged. Where did that additional value actually go? Today, coffee is grown across dozens of countries within the tropical belt that circles the planet, but global production is far from evenly distributed. Brazil remains the largest force in the market, supported by extensive farmland, mechanized operations, and enormous export capacity. Vietnam has become especially important through Robusta, grown in the Central Highlands, supplying much of the world's instant coffee and commercial blends. Colombia is closely associated with mountain-grown Arabica, while Ethiopia has returned to the center of attention through specialty regions whose floral and fruit-driven coffees are sought by buyers around the world. In one sense, the plant has completed a remarkable circle. It began in the forests of Ethiopia, crossed the Red Sea into Yemen, traveled through imperial networks and colonial plantations, and then returned to Ethiopia as one of the most celebrated origins in the modern market. But reputation has not brought power back in equal measure. The price of a cup is divided among farmers, local buyers, processors, exporters, importers, roasters, distributors, and retail chains. Those closest to the consumer often have the greatest ability to shape the final price, because they control branding, store access, packaging, convenience, and the story attached to the drink. The farmer, by contrast, may be forced to accept a price influenced by global supply, currency movements, contracts, and trading markets far beyond the farm. Even when coffee prices rise, income may not rise with them if fertilizer, labor, fuel, transport, and credit costs increase at the same time. A farmer also carries risks that a cafe customer never sees: disease, drought, excessive rain, damaged trees, unpredictable harvests, and weak bargaining power against larger buyers. This imbalance is now colliding with a threat that no merchant, empire, or global chain can fully control. Arabica coffee is highly sensitive to temperature and growing conditions. As average temperatures rise, rainfall becomes less reliable, and pests and diseases spread into new elevations. Some regions may become less suitable for the varieties that made them famous. Farmers in vulnerable areas face difficult choices. They can move production higher into cooler land, but mountains do not provide unlimited space. They can adopt more heat-resistant or disease-resistant varieties, but those plants may produce different flavors or require years before delivering a full harvest. They can change cultivation methods by adding shade trees, protecting soil moisture, and improving water management, but adaptation requires money and time. Some may eventually abandon coffee altogether. The irony is hard to miss. Coffee was once treated as a treasure that had to be protected from anyone who might steal and replant it. Today, the seed is widely available, but the climate and land capable of producing high-quality coffee may become the scarce resources. That shift reveals how the location of power has changed throughout the story. At first, power belonged to communities that knew where the plant grew and how it could be used. Yemen controlled export routes and viable seeds. Colonial empires controlled land, ships, credit, and labor. Governments feared the spaces where coffee drinkers exchanged ideas. Armies shaped distribution through mass purchasing. Industrial companies controlled scale and standardization. Modern brands control experience, customer loyalty, and access to the final consumer. The struggle never disappeared. It simply moved from forests and ports to plantations, factories, retail networks, financial markets, and now the changing climate itself. Coffee was once heated so others could not grow it, smuggled across oceans, planted on conquered land, and harvested by people who rarely shared in the wealth they created. It helped religious communities remain awake, gave merchants places to exchange information, offered soldiers a way to endure exhausting conditions, and helped modern economies extend the working day. The seed is no longer the secret. What is contested now is price, brand power, productive land, stable supply, and the share of profit contained in every cup. The history of coffee is therefore not simply the story of how one fruit spread around the world. It is the story of how human beings turned wakefulness into power and transformed an everyday desire into a global economic empire. The next time you hold a cup of coffee, ask yourself, among the people who planted it, harvested it, shipped it, roasted it, and sold it, who actually has the greatest power, and which part of this history changed the way you see coffee the most?